Good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Good. I hope you're enjoying yourselves so far. Unfortunately, I'm going to bring you down rather from the cheerfulness of Philip, at least for 3/4 or 2/3 of my talk, and then hopefully we'll lift you up at the end. How many people came to last year's conference? All right, because I've only got one St. George's Day joke, and I used it last year, and I wasn't sure whether I could use it again, but you've heard it already, so I won't tell you. So instead of that, I will just say that it's a great pleasure to be in the Midlands to mark St. George's Day, because I really think that the Midlands is a region which, for me, evokes that very essence of England. You know, when you think about St. George and Englishness and what it means to be English, invariably you conjure up idyllic images of the English countryside. And I suppose that emotional connection, dare I say a sacred connection between heart and home and land. And essential to that in creating that image really was one of Midland's own, J.R.R. Tolkien, son of Birmingham, who expressed this very vividly, particularly with his creation of the Shire and of Middle-earth. And of course that, we're told, was based on Sarehall, now a suburb of Birmingham, as well as his walks in the nearby Malvern Hills. And of course the Malverns are also the land of Edward Elgar. And of course we know he was inspired to write that most moving of all patriotic tunes, Nimrod, on those hills. So I can't think of anywhere more perfect to be on this St. George's weekend. But leaving, one second, do I have a clicker here? Yes, I do, right. Leaving Tolkien and Elgar aside, it's another son of the Midlands that I want to speak about today in terms of, well, just briefly to quote from him about England, and that's Birmingham's own son, Enoch Powell. How does this work? For those of you who don't know, Powell delivered his 1968 Rivers of Blood speech at Birmingham's MacDonald Burlington Hotel, which is about 5 minutes from where we're gathered today. And a few months after that explosive speech, he said to an audience in Eastbourne, "The English as a nation have their own peculiar faults. One of them is that strange passivity in the face of danger or absurdity or provocation." Well, ladies and gentlemen, after 2 decades of mass migration and a demographic shift which has forever altered the fabric of England, I think you'd agree that those words are truer now than they were ever. Because how can our mass migration mess be considered anything other than absurd, provocative, and dangerous? And who can deny that our response has been anything other than strangely passive? Indeed, passivity is surely an understatement. In the case of the Conservative government, a party once trusted on this issue, it's been a story not only of passivity, but of blindness and betrayal. Blindness to the consequences and a betrayal of the British people. 26 years have passed since Blair's election in 97, years equally split now between Labour and Tory, with 13 years each. And those 26 years have wrought upon this island the greatest act of national harm in our story. And the evidence is all around us. The evidence is all around us, but let me put it bluntly. We've had more immigration to Britain in the past 2 decades than in the past 2,000 years combined. It's astonishing to contemplate. No country, no society, and no people can sustain such rapid and dramatic demographic change. And of course, all this happened without anyone's consent. The British people were never given a vote on mass immigration, even though it's the single most significant event to have ever affected, or dare I say, afflicted this island. It's incalculably more profound than Brexit and the EU, and yet for a quarter of a century, our elected leaders have allowed it to continue all but unfettered, having been voted in to do just the opposite. So how has this come about? Well, we know why the Labour Party were, and indeed still are, keen on open borders. Their motivation has become the stuff of infamy. No Kenneth Williams lines there, please. It was all admitted by Andrew Neither, a former senior Labour advisor, who revealed that New Labour's mass migration experiment was a cavalier, back-of-the-envelope policy motivated by a desire to, quote, rub the right's noses in diversity. And as Peter Mandelson later admitted, the Labour government, quote, sent out search parties to seek immigrants to come to the UK. The ambition for this was to turn this largely homogenous nation into a truly multicultural country. Why? Because approximately 80% of ethnic minorities vote Labour. That's why. A major demographic shift would eventually provide the Labour Party with the prospect of electoral victory for decades to come. And a quarter of a century later, it's a policy which is clearly working. London, for example, is now essentially a one-party Labour state, and the same holds true for all those other cities where the once previous white majority now find themselves an ethnic minority. Bearing that in mind, one can understand why the radical left will be keen on mass migration, but that successive conservative governments have effectively continued this policy is as scandalous as it is shameful. For whilst New Labour used its 13 years to boldly implement its radical agenda and usher in the social and cultural revolution that we can all see around us today, the Tories have at best proved ineffectual, unmotivated, and unconcerned, squandering and mismanaging their time in office. At worst, they are complicit. For despite the tough talk and the empty manifesto pledges to cut immigration, it was the Tories who put the pedal to the migration metal, increasing mass immigration to levels beyond Labour's wildest dreams, whilst also permitting an industrial-scale criminal enterprise in illegal cross-channel crossings. In the year ending June 2022, long-term immigration into the UK was estimated at, any guesses? 1.1 million. That's an increase of 435,000 for the year ending June 2021. And let's put that into some context, because when people say, quite rightly, that Britain has a proud history of accepting immigrants, they often mention the Ugandan refugees who were kicked out of Uganda by Idi Amin in the 1970s. Well, the total number of Ugandan refugees who came to Britain was 27,000. And as many of you will remember, that figure of 27,000 was extremely large and controversial back in the 1970s. Today, 27,000 people come here every 10 days. I should also point out that when I say 1.1 million immigrants arrived here in 2022, I'm talking about gross migration, which is the true number. And it's very important when we discuss this issue that we don't simply accept the government's use of net migration figures as the correct measure. Indeed, I find it remarkable that the media and all the talking heads that you see on this subject, on both sides of the debate, almost always frame this discussion about net migration. And the difference between gross and net migration is very clear. Gross migration is the total number of people who have arrived on our shores in the last year. Net migration looks at the gross total and then subtracts all of those people who've left the country in the last year. So we had 1 million, but 500,000 people left, meaning there's a net migration figure of 500,000. But it's not, it's 1 million. But the government like to use that fact because as shocking as 500,000 is, it's far less incendiary than 1 million. But the fantasy that the government and others are trying to perpetuate with this net migration figure is that the 500,000 who left Blighty's shores are equivalent to the 500,000 who came in. It's a simple like-for-like swap in their opinion. But of course, that's complete nonsense. Who is leaving and who are coming is of great consequence and significance to the future of this land. A highly skilled emigrant isn't the equivalent of a low-skilled immigrant. And most importantly, of course, a huge percentage of those who leave the UK each year are British, not immigrants. Just think of that well-known phenomenon of white flight, which has seen a white British exodus from East London and various other cities in the industrial north and also in the Midlands. Now, some go elsewhere in the UK, to Essex and so forth, but a lot of them go to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Spain. As a result, in Britain today, the indigenous population, otherwise known as white British, is rapidly shrinking. In the 2001 census, 87.5% of the population of England and Wales identified as white British. By 2011, that figure had dropped to 80.5%, and by 2021 it was 74.4%. It's hard, perhaps impossible, to think of another example of an indigenous population of a majority country declining by 13% in the space of 2 decades. At the same time, the 2021 census results revealed that 42% of the 10 million foreign-born residents in England arrived in the last decade, and that's quite without precedent in our history. Here you can see the chart which shows the foreign-born population of Britain since the Great Exhibition of 1851, when it was 0.6%. It took 100 years to rise by 4% to 1951. Then it took 50 years to jump by another 4%. But now that 4% increase happens every decade. Perhaps more startlingly, in 2005, white British accounted for 75% of births in England and Wales. By 2019, that had slipped to 58%. In 2010, David Coleman, who is a distinguished professor of demography at the University of Oxford, predicted that white British would be a minority in the UK by 2066. That prediction was based upon migration figures which were half of those we are now experiencing. Now, of course, some will ask, why does this matter? Why are you raising all of this? As if this profound demographic, societal, and cultural shift is of no consequence. It does matter, and it matters on the most deep level. You no doubt have already heard, so I won't go into it, the very sound practical, economic, and political reasons why this matters: housing, school places, GP appointments, NHS waiting lists, benefits, etc. But just as important, and perhaps more so, is the impact this has on our culture and the cohesion of our communities and wider British society. Because at what point does Britain stop being Britain? What is the tipping point? If only 30% of the population of these islands is white British, will it still be Britain? How can the integration and assimilation of huge immigrant populations be achieved when the indigenous population is itself an ethnic minority? What will the dominant culture be for television, popular music, film, comedy, sport, the things that traditionally bind a nation and its peoples together? And what about social cohesion and the impact of mass migration on our local communities and indeed our ability just to go about and enjoy our daily life? Because we already know that superdiversity, which is the term given to in cities and elsewhere where you have a hugely diverse population, superdiversity leads to populations living segregated lives with no contact with each other, parallel lives rarely engaging with anyone other than people that they know. Superdiversity often leads to people being suspicious not just of other cultures or ethnicities, but even of people from their own culture too. And a walk through the East End of London will show you that diversity in action. For example, just imagine 2 or 3 old ladies at a bus stop. We know that if they are of different cultural backgrounds, it's far less likely that they will start up a random conversation than if they were all from the same cultural background. In these and similar ways, our communities are becoming less cohesive. We know in Scandinavia, for example, which of course is very proud of its welfare state and its support for all people, that taxpayers are less happy to pay taxes for welfare when the people receiving the benefits don't resemble them. It's human nature. The cultural divide, of course, is already well underway in this country. As Lord Tebbit has said, we have imported far too many immigrants who have come here not to live in our society, but to replicate here the society of their homelands. And we saw stark evidence of this recently in Leicester, where Muslim and Hindu mobs clashed on the streets following a cricket match. All too often, replicating the society of their homelands means importing to these shores the conflicts, the prejudices, and the disputes of faraway lands. For example, we're often told now that anti-Semitism, homophobia, and misogyny are on the rise in Britain. Yet the mainstream media remain reluctant to say why. It's the greatest elephant in the room. Time and again, petrified by political correctness and beholden to the ideology of multiculturalism, governments, councils, the police, and other public institutions have shown themselves unwilling to face the challenge and unable to admit that however lofty the ideal, multicultural diversity isn't a strength. It divides towns and cities, and it destroys social cohesion. I mean, does anyone really seriously believe that Britain and America are more socially cohesive than Poland or Japan? Be that as it may, Britain is now a multiracial society, but that's very different from being a multicultural society. A multiracial society which has a shared set of values and a single dominant culture embraced by all can be strong, cohesive, and successful. The distinction between race and culture is of paramount importance, and I say this also as a child of immigrants. It's in all of our interests in Britain becoming not a multicultural society. We must remain a united kingdom, not a united nations. So how on earth can we achieve all of this? Well, ideally, I'd have an hour to lay out various hugely detailed policies and solutions, but for now, I'd like to focus on two of the most important and simplest priorities, which, if implemented by serious successive governments, because it's not a short project, would go a considerable way to improving our future. Firstly, it's no longer sufficient to simply end mass migration. Britain needs a complete moratorium on almost all future migration for at least a decade, ideally for a generation. Now, a full generation poses real practical difficulties, but whether we halt migration for a decade or a generation, the nation needs breathing space. Time to assimilate those who've arrived, time for our infrastructure, our schools and NHS to catch up with that new demographic reality, and time for the nation to take stock of itself. America in the early 20th century was riven with social tension and unrest following decades of mass migration from around the world in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries. Many of the fears that were expressed then are similar to those that one hears now. America's response was to dramatically restrict immigration to the country, starting in the 1920s, right through to the 1960s. The motivation was, quote, to preserve the ideal of US homogeneity. Now, it's no coincidence that those 4 decades, 1920 to 1960, were America's golden age, the era of unprecedented stability, social cohesion, and self-confidence. But once our 10 or generation-long moratorium ends, what then? Well, the level of immigration that we eventually decide to agree on is for the British people to decide, not for me. But in deciding what level of immigration is appropriate for the future, perhaps the research of Professor Coleman might again offer useful guidance. Coleman offered 3 examples of how different immigration levels would affect the nation. Remember, he said by the 2060s, the white British would be a minority if immigration continued at the 2010 level. But if you reduced it way down to 80,000, then white British would become a minority in 2080. If you use a cross-party group of MPs' recommendation of balanced migration, which basically means one out, one in, then the white British would become a minority at the end of the century. But even if we had a complete halt on migration, 0 migrants coming over, then by the end of the century, white Britons would be the majority, but only with around 70% of the population. Now, the second thing after stopping migration for a few years is, of course, assimilation and integration, because controlling immigration isn't enough to solve the issue of mass migration and the segregated communities and the problems arising therefrom already in our land. But assimilation and integration requires the promotion of a robust and confident British culture in all areas of public life, and that's clearly very much not in evidence today. Because what incentive is there actually for a young ethnic minority person to buy into Britain? How can we expect them to believe in Britain and the West when our media, our universities, and our cultural institutions denigrate Britain's legacy and the West's achievements? When minority cultures are elevated above British culture, and when our students leave school with almost no knowledge of British history or civic values. In that context, who can blame a child for cleaving more to the masculine, well-defined culture of his parents? Aristotle once said, "Give me a boy till the age of 7, and I'll show you the man." Well, of course, in cities across the nation, ethnic minorities now make up the overwhelming majority of school places. Integration into British society can only happen through the moulding of young minds. Now, singing the national anthem in assemblies, portrait of the king in the schools, Union flag flying outside the school, all marvellous and fine and good. But we need to go much further than that, in particular through the national curriculum at primary and secondary school levels, making history compulsory to the age of 16 and also requiring civic courses to teach our values and freedoms. Because the degree of historical ignorance amongst all age groups in the population is absolutely appalling, because people can now finish history at the age of 14, knowing just about the Tudors, the American West, and the Nazis. If they've ever heard of Churchill at all, they think he's a fictional character today, or a dog with a nodding head. Children must learn our magnificent island story. Otherwise, they'll continue to believe the rot that they're told about Britain and slavery, about Britain's racist past, and about the supposed crimes of our greatest heroes, from Nelson to Churchill. You can't participate in the present if you don't understand the past. That means learning the truth about the universality of slavery, about Africa's role in slavery, and about Britain's unique role in abolishing the slave trade. That means learning about both the positives and the negatives of the British Empire, and learning how Britain, dare I say England, created the modern world. Meanwhile, civics or citizenship classes must teach our children the importance of freedom of speech, freedom of expression, tolerance of opposing views and of other faiths, and the truth about Britain and race. They need to understand how the freedoms were hard fought: free speech, free assembly, free expression. That these were actually British developments shared by only a few other countries. That these freedoms and rights are not valued in other lands, including the lands from which many of them have come. And what happens to societies when free speech is taken away? Because we now know that the youth of today think causing offense is worse than free speech. And we must teach them the truth, as I've said, about Britain and race, and that's so important. Namely, that Britain is one of the world's most tolerant and least racist countries, that racism is alive and well in all parts of the globe, including in Africa and in Asia, and that Britain and the Anglosphere and Scandinavia stand in stark contrast to that. All of this has to form part of our core education system. But of course, that's not enough, because to hope to get any of that history taught to students means going to war with teachers and the teacher training colleges, the madrasas of the woke religion. Teachers are more left-wing now than at any point in history, with fewer than 10% voting Conservative. They are beholden to progressive ideologies. Consequently, the degree to which the young children and students of today hold views that differ from those who are just 10 or 15 years older is truly shocking. We have to bring an end to the radical ideologies that prevail in our schools and which seek to undermine Britain and the West. And that means a complete overhaul of our teacher training system and an abolition of teacher training colleges and a sweeping out of the old and bringing in something that actually works effectively for the best interest of the child and the nation. Ethnic minorities and their white classmates are currently being brainwashed into thinking that Britain and its institutions are inherently racist, that they are victims deserving of special treatment, that whiteness is shameful, and that Western civilization needs to be decolonized and dismantled. If we don't tackle this cancer at the heart of our education system, I can't see how it will ever be possible to successfully integrate ethnic minorities into the fabric of the British nation. We are in a battle of culture and of civilizations, make no mistake about that. And in these battles, only the strong win. I've said many times in the past that a civilization that won't defend its culture doesn't deserve to exist. God willing, Britain can still summon up the strength, the fortitude, and the resolution to be victorious once more. Thank you.